All right, so thanks for hosting me in the Brown Bag series. Like I said, I'm Charles Chimera. I'm the Weed Risk Assessment Specialist for the state. I've been doing this job now for almost 10 years, and I wanted to give like a little bit of an overview about what I do as part of my job and some of the applications and uses that the Weed Risk Assessment has been used for throughout the state. I'm going to focus on things that have happened in the last year to year and a half, but there's definitely more that I could talk about, and I'll try to keep it well under an hour. But just to begin, for people that are not familiar with the weed risk assessment or maybe haven't given it much thought lately, I wanted to give a little bit of a background about how the system came to be used in Hawaii. And after seeing Josh's presentation last month with his multimedia video and everything, talking about a Hill Bill Becomes a Law and the Schoolhouse Rock video he showed, he set the bar for entertainment value. And because the weed risk assessment can be a little bit dry and boring, I wanted to start off with a little bit of a more entertaining introduction, and then I'll get into all the boring details after that. So bear with me for the next minute. Okay, so that's the introduction, and that's how I'm going to get sued for copyright infringement. But basically, yeah, I just wanted to give an overview of the history of the weed risk assessment. It's a proactive tool used to identify plants that pose a higher risk of causing ecological or economic harm. And as it was mentioned in the opening music, the system used in Hawaii is based on, well, it was chosen after evaluating 3 systems that were being used around the world, one from South Africa, one from North Africa, and one from Australia. And the accuracy or the predictive ability of the 3 systems was compared, and the Australian system proved to be the most accurate. It was about 93% accurate at predicting high risk or invasive plants. The Australian system was first developed in 1994, and it was used there and then modified and tested for use in New Zealand. Because they were demonstrating its utility in Australia, people in Hawaii decided to see if it might be useful here. And some of the questions needed to be tweaked for use in Hawaii, but it was modified and tested for use in 1998. There were some further testing and modifications done in the early 2000s. And since 2002, a weed risk assessment specialist or specialist has been funded most recently by the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. The system is based on a series of 49 questions about the biology, ecology, and history of invasiveness of a plant elsewhere. The answers you give to those questions are assigned a score, and then the end score that is generated places plants into one of these 3 categories, whether they are high risk or low risk of becoming invasive. The main benefits of this system, because people in conservation have always been identifying invasive plants, high-risk plants, ever since people have been managing lands. The benefit of the weed risk assessment system is that it's meant to be objective, so your own personal biases shouldn't come into how a question is answered in determining the risk of a plant. It's science-based. the system that was developed in Australia and in Hawaii. They've been run through and published in peer-reviewed journals. They're meant to be repeatable so that if one person goes through the 49 questions and another person does it, they should come up with basically the same results. There may be a little bit of nuance in how a question is answered, but generally the results are considered to be pretty repeatable. It's also transparent in that the results that are generated aren't kept secret. They're published, in quotes, online so that anybody can see how the questions were answered and how the risk rating was determined. And as I mentioned about the reliability of the assessments, they are pretty accurate at predicting the risk of invasiveness, 90+% accurate. So those are the main reasons why this system has been used in Hawaii and elsewhere. A little bit more background about it. It's designed to identify all types of pest plants, natural areas, pests of agriculture and forestry, and just overall nuisance species. And all 49 questions don't need to be answered. The more questions that are answered, the more, I'd say, reliable the rating would be, but you don't need to answer all of them. And the assessment can be done relatively quickly. A really thorough one takes about 2 days. A quick and dirty one can be done in under 1 day. And now I wanted to go through some of the highlights of the program over the last year. As of December 31st, there are 1,818 species that have been screened. They're roughly equally divided between high and low risk plants and some more in the gray or evaluate category, and with an approximately 400,000 estimated flowering plant species worldwide. I figured that at a rate of about 100 to 125 assessments per year, it'll take a little over 3,000 years for all of the remaining species to be screened. So, got a little bit of a workload ahead of me. The weed risk assessment has been used by government, public industry, and conservation groups statewide and internationally. So next I'd like to highlight some of those uses in the various categories, both public and private. First off, the landscaping and horticultural industry has been gradually adopting and using the results of the weed risk assessment to as part of their practices for growing and selling plants statewide. And for this, I wanted to highlight the PlantPono Endorsement Program. That's a program that is promoting the use of native and low-risk or non-invasive plants in landscaping horticulture throughout the state, and discouraging the use of high-risk or invasive plants. This PlantPono endorsement is part of the PlantPono program that Christy Martin helped develop, and there's a PlantPono website that talks about this a lot. But essentially, to be a PlantPono endorsed business, some criteria need to be met. They essentially deal with discontinuing use of high-risk or invasive plants and utilizing the weed risk assessment for any new introductions of plants into the state. And the PlantPono business is being promoted, or the PlantPono endorsement program is being promoted right now on the Big Island and on Kauai. And currently, I think, when I last checked, there are 17 Big Island businesses that are PlantPono endorsed. On the island of Kauai, some of the criteria for being a PlantPono endorsed business are a little bit different, but the main components about using the weed risk assessment and discontinuing the use of high-risk or invasive plants is part of that process. And there are currently 9 Kauai businesses endorsed. And there's talk about trying to get some Maui businesses to adopt this PlantPono endorsement as well. One thing to point out about the PlantPono endorsement is it is voluntary, so there's no regulatory compliance associated with using the weed risk assessment or being PlantPono endorsed. It's essentially trying to use the power of persuasion to encourage the use of native and low-risk plants and discourage the use of high-risk plants. So until we learn, more effective powers of persuasion, this is the best system we have, and it does seem to be relatively well received in the areas where it's being used. Other ways that we've been reaching the landscaping and horticultural industry are through partnerships with the Landscape Industry Council of Hawaii, and I and Amanda Skelton, who is a former PlantPono liaison, have been writing articles periodically for their Hawaii Landscape magazine. I did one last year on invasive aquatic plants, and I have another article coming out in the January-February 2017 issue. So the LICH members seem to be pretty well educated in the risks of invasive plants, and they seem to have come on board in adopting it, the weed risk assessment, as part of their planning process. I get requests from the general public periodically to screen plants. They're completely random, come from all different types of people interested in growing plants. I had somebody on the Big Island who wanted to plant a butterfly garden to provide habitat for monarch butterflies, and specifically he wanted to import different species of balloon plants to use as a host for the monarch caterpillars. And after doing some screenings and finding some very high-risk invasive plants that are not currently found in the state, I was able to discourage him from importing any new species and just use the weeds that we already have here in the islands for his monarch butterfly garden. And over on the right, the Agathis australis, I get random requests like that all the time from people that want to know whether or not something they plant on their property has a chance of becoming invasive. Botanical Gardens in the state have been using the weed risk assessment too, that use it very regularly, and I get requests from them all the time, are the Honolulu Botanical Garden and National Tropical Botanical Garden. Just about every month I'll get a request from one or the other of them asking about a plant that they want to grow and cultivate, and whether or not, in some cases, it should be removed from the garden setting. So high-risk plants have been discontinued in use in both of those locations. At the university level, the College of Tropical Ag and Human Resources has been using the weed risk assessment as part of their operations and programs. Last year, I got a request from the Honolulu County Extension agent asking about this tree curry bush that has the potential to become invasive, and so they pulled it from their Arbor Day giveaway as a result of the WRA results. And the education specialist on Oahu was using a seed mix to grow a pollinator garden as part of their Master Gardener program, and pulled a bunch of plants in that mix that were identified as high risk from their garden activities. The invasive species committees throughout the state have been using the weed risk assessment results fairly regularly as part of their early detection process. Plants that are identified as high risk are put on the lists to be on the lookout for as the early detection botanists travel around the various islands. They've been also using it as part of their prioritization process for target species, and as well as outreach. And the PlantPono endorsement program has really been a success because of the outreach of the different island invasive species committees, especially Big Island and Kauai. Land managers have been using the weed risk assessment results also to prioritize weed control and management efforts. And one big one the last year was the Office of Mauna Kea Management on the Big Island. They wanted all of their non-native plants on the property that they managed run through the weed risk assessment to help them identify high priority plants that they should be targeting for management and control. And just this past year, I finished the remaining 31 that had not yet been screened. So there's some utility for land managers throughout the islands to use the WRA. On the government level, the county governments have been using weed risk assessment results. In particular, the Maui County government commissioned or hired an arborist to write the Maui County planting plan, and they were using the weed risk assessment results to screen plants for inclusion on that planting plan. And there was just a write-up on that in the Star Advertiser last weekend, specifically about the guy who wrote the plan. And one of the things that was highlighted in this article was that the new planting plan does not include a single invasive species recommendation other than turf grasses. And so that's considered to be one of the selling points of this county planting plan. And they're also mentioning that although this is the only such plan that exists for a county throughout the state, they're hoping that it can be used as a blueprint for other islands. So this is pretty proactive. The Maui County government has, this is the third version of the planting plan. The first two did have a lot of invasive trees on the plan, and since that time, they've become very cognizant of the fact that, you know, at the same time as they're promoting plantings throughout county lands on the island, they're funding watershed partnerships and invasive species committees to control some of these same plants. So they decided that, you know, rather than to you know, be at cross purposes like that, they just promote low-risk, non-invasive, and native plants throughout county lands. And so that's considered to be a big success over here. State government agencies have been using weed risk assessment results. Last year, I got a request from Kauai DOFA. They were talking about using catnip or Nepeta cateria as an attractant to attract feral cats. It's part of their trapping and control program, and after finding out that it could pose a risk of invasiveness in higher elevation state lands, they decided to not use that and look for other methods as a cat attractant. And likewise on the Big Island, DOFA gets requests for cultivation of plants and trees on their lands that they manage, and so I've received requests from them to screen various trees that are being used. And this one in particular, lemonwood, a researcher wanted to do work on it, and it was identified as kind of a gray area tree that could be invasive in certain circumstances. So they used that to modify some of their permit process. And the federal government uses the weed risk assessment in Hawaii, particularly the Natural Resources Conservation Service promotes the weed risk assessment on their website and uses it to identify low-risk plants for projects that they support and promote, as well as to identify high-risk invasive species to avoid. Michael Constantinides, in particular, has been very proactive at contacting me about getting weed risk assessments for different projects that he's promoting, and he's identified it as an important source of information for the projects that he manages. For international uses, this is just an overview of some of the areas where the weed risk assessment websites get some traffic and viewing. And so even though it's specifically meant to be used in Hawaii and other tropical Pacific islands, people from all over the world do use the weed risk assessment. It's still being used in Australia and New Zealand, so there's some crossover in recognition of its value. In the last few years, in particular, the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment has been asked to screen plants for various uses. In particular, the IUCN last year, as part of their the conference in Hawaii, they wanted to create some promotional materials, including the use of this orchid on some of their promotional materials, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be promoting something that could be invasive in the islands. CABI in England has used the weed risk assessment and has published the results on their website, and in particular, results of the WRA will appear on their invasive species compendium, which is basically a worldwide database of invasive plants and animals. And the plant over there on the right, just every once in a while I'll get a random request from somebody, and this was from the South Africa National Biodiversity Institute. They wanted a weed risk assessment done on a cactus in South Africa. So even though it wasn't specific to South Africa, they still identified its utility for some of their management and planning. I mentioned about the PlantPono endorsement program. The PlantPono website is still up and running, and as part of that, there is a weed risk assessment tab on there. So for all of the latest weed risk assessments results, you can access those through the PlantPono website. I update it on a regular basis as new assessments are completed. And this is really meant to be like the user-friendly website for the maybe non-technical or non-scientific person in the promotion of low-risk or non-invasive plants. I'll also give presentations throughout the state promoting the weed risk assessment, promoting non-invasive plants, and promoting the use of native plants in horticulture and landscaping. In particular, I give a lot of presentations to the master gardeners. I've given them on Kauai, the Big Island, and this year I'll also be giving presentations to the Maui master gardeners. And they've been really great at helping update the PlantPono website as well. In particular, part of their master gardener training, they contribute species pages for plants that are identified as alternatives to high-risk or invasive plants. So, rather than just using the stick all the time and telling people what they can't or shouldn't grow, we also try to give low-risk, non-invasive alternatives and encourage people to use those instead. So, lastly, wanted to mention a project that was funded by the Colony Urban Forestry Project and promoted by Christy Martin. This was a project where it was meant to develop a list of known invasive plants to be restricted from introduction, propagation, and distribution and sale in Hawaii. This was a contract that was given to Shaheen Ansari, former weed risk assessment specialist, my predecessor in this position. And this project is an attempt to identify plants that are not yet known to be present in Hawaii that are clearly considered to be invasive or problematic, and that could be possibly added to some type of restricted plant list for regulation or prevention of importation into Hawaii. And as part of that process, weed risk assessment results have been used to identify and rank these plants in terms of their risk of invasiveness. And I believe, in talking with Christy recently, that project should be wrapping up soon, within the next few months. So the results of that project should be available sometime in the spring of this year. So that is it for me, and I just wanted to say that this project is, gratefully, I'm grateful that HISC continues to fund it, and it is available for everybody to use, and my contact information for weed risk assessments is down at the bottom of the page, and the PlantPono website is available for everyone as well. So if there's time and if anybody is interested, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.